Welcome to the Nintendo Archive. This is episode 12, and I am your host, Holden. I think it's going to be a shorter show today. Then again, I've said that before. Before I get started, I would like to thank all those who listened, and I would like to thank Father, Son, and Holy Spirit for giving me the opportunity to do this podcast once again. I only have one game to talk about in my what I've been playing section this week, though I'll refer to this particular what I've been playing as new to me, and going forward, that will be what it's called whenever I play a game that is new to me. And for this week, that game is Shantae for the GameBoy Color. I believe this is one of the last published games for the Game Boy Color, or last exclusively published perhaps, because it came out in 2002. I believe the Game Boy Advance was already out in probably 2001, either spring or I'm going to think November. But so this game is one of the last big Game Boy Color games, and it went on to be its own franchise. And within that franchise, they've done some pretty good work in the Metroidvania space. Though I don't consider the two Shantae games I've played to be really Metroidvanias, at least not in feel, but that's just me. But this first game that I've never touched before, playing it, it's a very interesting title. For one, it retains all the Metroid/Zelda elements that the franchise is known for. For whatever reason, I thought Shantae was going to be level-based and a smaller scale project, because the developer was smaller scale, as I understand it. But the game is very large in scope for a Game Boy Color game. It's a full-on side-scroller adventure with a tied-together world and multiple areas and multiple temples and collectibles and all that. As a game, it's very good looking too. The sprite work is quite advanced for a Game Boy Color game, and the colors in the game are particularly good. Especially when nighttime comes and the saturation changes on the character and the world, it looks really good. That's, visually speaking, I think that's the best thing about it, that color change. It is a platformer, and as platformers go, I think it's kind of fine. Like, it's not incredible by any means. It's no Super Mario World. Shantae's jump is, I don't know if it's floaty or stiff, but it looks a little funny, but it works. You do have the ability to run, though. For the first couple hours of the game, I was not aware of that, because the run is on your B button, which is also your hair whip button. And I think different people will have different experiences, but from my experience, I think that did enough to obfuscate the mechanic. And I could tell that there was a running challenge in one of the temples where the surfaces are spaced far enough apart that only a run will make you clear them. But I just figured it was like some unlockable. So I don't know if that's a flaw of the game, but I didn't love that. That might just be a character flaw of mine where I don't do a number of different little things. But whatever the case, the platforming is reasonably good enough. Once you unlock the monkey transformation, because this is a Shantae game, so you can use dance moves to become different creatures. The monkey is interesting in a platforming manner, because the monkey can climb up walls, and not only that, if you hit the button again, You can change that climb into like a bound, so you can bound up walls at a quicker rate. So that's interesting enough. But overall, the platforming is fine. Combat-wise, I think it fares a little better because the enemies, they're a little more interesting than, say, Mario enemies. And you can unlock attacks that are kind of neat, such as a upward flip kick, and then you can upgrade that again to have a air dash in there. And that makes the combat theoretically more interesting and serves as a good carrot on the stick for the rest of the game, because you have to pay for these moves in certain shops. I think, though, in terms of structure and world design and the Metroidvania Zelda design of the game, this game's not very good. Granted, I've only cleared 2 temples, and there's probably 2 more in a final level. So I'll have to get back to this game at some point. I've taken a break for now. The majority of the time you spend in the game is not in any real level. It's in these overworld sections, such as a desert or a rice field or wheat field, I don't know, or in a forest or a swamp. And these overworld sections are really wide and vertical. So there's a lot of space to operate within them, which is hypothetically interesting. But it's not actually interesting because they place these little bottomless pits in these overworld sections. And I don't think bottomless pits in any kind of Metroid or Zelda game are all that good or conducive to the rest of the design anyway, but it's even worse in this case because they give you this big open space to climb to a high spot and jump and see how far you can get with that added height. But then you just plop down into one of these bottomless pits and you lose a life, and you lose enough lives, you game over and you go back to a save, or even if you don't lose enough lives, you start at the very beginning of this long stretch of land. And I don't know if there's no redeeming qualities about these sections, but they're not terribly interesting as platforming bits. They kind of feel like filler, which is fine. I like filler in games, as I said with No More Heroes. But these bits of filler are largely pointless. You can grind for money, which I did in the early hours, and I'm like, oh, that's why they're here, so you can accumulate some funds while you're having a hard time. But other than that, there's nothing really going on there. It's some simple platforming and some twists and turns every now and then, such as going high or going low or whatever, and avoiding some enemies. And that's really all there is to it. And I think most of the game is just this. I've only done 3 of these sections, and there's probably 5 or so, but I didn't think they were any good. I know they show up in Shantae in the Pirate's Curse, and I think they do a good job with their role in that game. A much better job than this one anyway. But in this one, they're too long and too uninteresting. And as nice as the nighttime sprites are, the enemies get harder at night, which just serves to waste more time. And since I mentioned wasting time, sometimes in these overworld areas, the progression forward is more obscure than I'd like for the kind of area they are, which isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world, but eventually it sort of just gets to you that these areas are both padded, boring, and confusing all at the same time. It makes them uninteresting. And then for the temples themselves, they're okay, I guess. I thought the first temple was pretty good. It's not exactly a Zelda tier temple in terms of puzzles or design, but they have some interesting little memory puzzles and some timing-based platforming that makes them more interesting than the overworld anyway. But even they aren't that interesting, in my opinion. Particularly the second dungeon. That particular dungeon is comprised of a long elevator shaft, and there's about 6 to 8 pathways leading out from that main shaft. So you kind of start from the bottom and work your way up, and the dungeon isn't without good ideas. It's just that the layout is kind of rudimentary and uninteresting. Just kind of a trial and error of going this way, then walking back, then going to the next area. I don't know. The layout's not that interesting, and it's a little confusing because you forget which identical looking pathway leads to where. That's really it. So for a game that's kind of well remembered, I'm pretty sure that's how people remember the original Shantae, it's very mediocre in its moment-to-moment gameplay overall, despite some good ideas and good sprite work. And I know people enjoy the music. I don't know if Jake Kaufman did the original soundtrack, but it's that sort of thing. And it's fine. I don't really like the mid-Eastern kind of pop fusion, whatever you want to call it, as much as other people. But it's fine. It's not my favorite GameBoy Color soundtrack by any means. But I haven't finished it. I'll probably give it another go. I'll just have to go to a walkthrough to find my way through the swamp land, because I just don't know. It might be that I just went the wrong way, which is very, very possible, because they kind of tell you where you're supposed to go once, and maybe you can have it reiterated if you go to the right person, but you're kind of just supposed to know it from memory and then just proceed from those vague directions. Either way, the game is, thus far, I'd say fine. It's okay. I just don't think it's anywhere close to some of the better Game Boy Color games. And with that, that will conclude my new to me segment. And after this short musical interlude, we will proceed into our Wii game review. So, welcome back to the Wii game review section of the podcast. The game I'll be discussing this time around is Red Steel 2. Red Steel 2 is a sequel to a launch game that was not universally hated, but people were certainly lukewarm on. And Red Steel 2 has almost nothing to do with its predecessor that I can think of. There is samurai swords, katana swords, whatever you want to call them, and there is guns. That is the only connective tissue they have. The art style is different, the universe is different, the mechanics are different. And the levels are different. Everything's different, really. Outside of having a gun and a sword at the same time, everything is different. But anyway, as for the game itself, Red Steel 2 takes place in a fictional world that is a fusion of East and West, kind of a samurai world with a Wild West world. And the protagonist is a gunslinger, Ronin type, I don't know, either or and both and, really. And at the beginning of the game, he's an outcast, and at the end of it, he's redeemed himself and taken vengeance on his enemies. I could get more into the story than that, but I don't think there's really anything more to say. In terms of gameplay and structure, the game is a hack and slash first-person shooter action-adventure game with looting and upgrading set on the periphery, all of which takes place in these expansive, interconnected, hub-like levels. The gameplay of Red Steel 2 is heavily leveraged on the Wii Motion Plus accessory, in that it allows players to perform one-to-one movements with the character on screen. Now, these gestures don't always register, but in terms of Wii motion control gameplay, this is probably the most ambitious title on the system, and probably the most successful too. The way that the controls work is that the gun and sword are always immediately accessible. A swinging gesture will bring out the sword, and a press of the B trigger will bring the gun out. So it's all very snappy. The game is developed to primarily focus on the sword, so most of the enemies in your encounters will be wielding a sword, with gun-carrying enemies serving as auxiliary or backup. Even so, the guns in this game are still quite effective. They're responsive, they have good stopping power, and are well integrated into the movement of the character and into the combat encounters throughout the game. But the star of the show is definitely the sword. The sword play is similar to that of Wii Sports Resort or even Skyward Sword to an extent, where directional attacks and directional blocking are at the heart of it. But the game takes things a little farther than those two games. In terms of the basics, the game features 2 different attack strengths depending on how hard you swing the remote. The light attack being speedier, but the heavy attack doing more damage and breaking armor. And the game also puts an emphasis on edge alignment when blocking enemies' strong attacks. But that's just the basic combat in the game. As the rest of the game unfolds, there are hidden powers and unlockable moves that can only be performed by specific inputs. There's an execution system in the game that rewards specific gestures, and there's a number of things like that. It's certainly more involved than other sword fighting games on the Wii. Another thing Red Steel 2 puts a lot of emphasis on is movement. In addition to the sword swinging and IR aiming, the A button serves as a dash, and most of your attacks are initiated by this dash movement. You can dash backwards, you can dash to the side, you can dash forward. If you tap dash twice, you can do an aerial attack, much like a jump attack from Zelda. And I'm not sure there's anything more to it than that, but the dash does give the game a great sense of speed and serves as one of the 3 pillars for the combat: shooting, swinging, and dashing. And how you put those together serves as the basis for what kind of attack you'll do as you unlock more and more attacks. And the end result is pretty spectacular, I'd say. I don't know if it's terribly deep, but it's just innately enjoyable throughout, and while the enemies may lack some variety, though the developer does try their best, the number of ways in which you can kill them is variety enough. There's too many ways to kill them, really. You'll never remember to use all of your skills, but it's a lot of fun stringing together multiple moves and attacks. And very stylish too. The animations in this game are quite excellent. In terms of some of the better moves in the game, or at least I think they're really cool, I forget what it's called, the storm. The storm move is essentially just a spin attack like in Zelda, though it's much more impressive from a first person viewpoint. And while it can hit multiple enemies, which is cool enough as it is, and break guards, the interesting thing about it is how it uses the lock-on system. When you have an enemy behind you, a little icon will pop up, and it will be on either your left or right. And that's actually kind of important. And you can just hit Z and lock onto them in a Zelda-like fashion. Or you can keep them behind you, and if they go to attack you or get very close, the icon will turn red, and there will be a little chime that plays. If you tap Z while also swinging the Wii remote in that direction, which is normally how you do a hurricane spin, instead, if you've swung it in the right direction, either from left to right or right to left, your character will then, instead of doing a spin, he'll spin the sword in his hand so the point's facing behind him, and then he'll dash backwards and stick that point right in the guy's gut. And it will work on almost any character in the game, except for the more armored ones. But you can take out characters and enemies that would have otherwise been much more of a hassle that way, and it just looks really cool. And in the heat of the moment, when you're hitting two guys in front of you and then you pull that off, it feels great. Another move I like a lot is one that's like a hidden samurai power that is different from your sword moves, but if you hold A and B together, you charge your sword up. And from there, there's a number of moves you could do. You could do a ground quake that knocks enemies on their feet, or you could do a wind gust that knocks enemies back and even off cliffs. But the one I like to do is where you swing up, and if you catch an enemy, you throw them right up into the air. And if you use a double barrel shotgun, you can shoot them while they're hanging in the air and probably kill them. But if you hit A, you can actually jump after them, and your character will jump right in the air and you can smash them down. And I think if they're lying on their back and you do a swing down motion, you'll drive your sword right into their stomach while they're on the ground in that Legend of Zelda finisher move kind of way. And it's really satisfying because you're coming down from like 20 feet and driving that sword right into them in this quick manner. And there's a number of things like that. The special moves have an execution animation to them, where if an enemy has the execution icon above their head and it's asking for you to either strike them or thrust them through, if you pull off the appropriate hidden move, you'll get that cool animation with the matador, which is where you dash around the enemy and strike them in the back. If they're in their final throws, if you do that, your character will spin his sword around into the ice grip and then ram the sword point into their back in a savage way. If you use what's called the ram, which is a guard breaker where you just hit them with your sword handle, if you do that on an enemy that is downed, you'll take their face and just smash it on the ground. It's all really good looking. Even the way the character puts away his pistol, where he twirls it around his finger lazily. The game's very stylish, and all the moves have a number of functions to them that make them interesting to pull off, and they string together really well. The combat in this game is superb, and the best example of Wii motion sword fighting there is, really. I think my brother said one time, and I kind of agree with him, that all these extra moves do take away from the purity of just directional swinging, where exchanging blows like you do in Wii Sports Resort or Skyward Sword is kind of gone from this game, but what they replace it with is more interesting and more stylish and more visceral and a little more deep. Really, without question, it's the best part of Red Steel 2. It's the thing that makes it a good game, if not a great game. And it really is a one-of-a-kind combat system. As for the next best thing about this game, that would probably be the visuals. And I could probably throw in the audio too. The visuals, as I said, are a mixture of East and West, Wild West, with medieval Japan or whatever era. I'm not schooled up on all the different looks of Japan, so that's my guess. But either way, that's not all there is to them. They're also heavily cel-shaded, so they kind of look like a game from the PS2 era called 13. Not exactly like that, but since that's a Ubisoft title, it's a fair comparison. And in addition to the Japanese Western look, the game also sports a very futurized, mechanical, electric kind of aesthetic too. So it's not purely rustic. And the character models are particularly good in the game. The enemy character models and the hero character model alike. The protagonist is dressed up as a cowboy for the most part, with a cowboy hat and a long trench coat down to his feet. But his arms have van braces on them, and his back is metallic looking, the logo on it, and he looks really good. The enemies, initially, they look kind of Western too, with chaps and vests and whatever, the jackal thugs anyway. But then as you get into the lower parts of the city where the game mostly takes place, they start to look more like samurai, futuristic samurai with chrome armor. And likewise, the environments are much the same, where the first area of the game is very Western, but as you get down to the lower city, it becomes futuristic Japanese looking with those certain kind of tile roofs, and I don't really know what you call the shape of a Japanese roof, but that's what it looks like, and it looks really good. And in tandem with the cel shading, the game has a unique and timeless look. It hasn't aged poorly at all. I think it's actually gotten better with age. As for other character models and locales, the ninja enemies of the game look really good. They look kind of techno-y with bright red stripes on their black suits, while their faces are obscured by these chrome masks. I really like the look of them overall, and I especially like the concept art that is put on the screen as they are introduced to you when you see them for the first time. It's really excellent concept art. I would like to see a Red Steel 3 that has a art style based on that concept art, but it's really striking stuff overall. And I don't know if I like it as much as everyone else does. I know people like the music particularly, with its fusion style that fits this game world very well. It never rung terribly true for me. I think some of the boss music is really good, particularly the last boss that has more Eastern music. But I know other people have responded very positively to the audio of the game and, of course, the visuals as well. In terms of the weaker aspect of the game, for a game that looks really good and plays really well, the game those elements are placed in is simply above average for the most part. The levels of Red Steel 2, their structure is... I didn't really know what to make of it until I played Resident Evil 4, but that's what they remind me of. They're very linear and interconnected, but they're more hub-like than Resident Evil 4, and their design is fine. It's just kind of above average. The main interaction with the world is simply walking around and shooting or hitting things to get money out of them. Everything in the environment is destructible, and that's a lot of fun as it is. I kind of like shooting locks off of lockers. Well, they're not really lockers. Gun cases, probably, is what they are, that have these two red locks on them, and then you shoot them with your pistol to open it up, and there's ammo or money in there. There's also a lot of phone booths and barrels and wall-mounted fans that you can shoot. Everything has money in it, so you go around breaking stuff, and that's the main way the game spaces out the fighting, which does serve a purpose, because I was playing on challenge mode just before recording here, and I find the game is a little, not boring, but the combat kind of loses its novelty when you're just kind of going from one main objective to the next without any of this looting and breaking stuff. So the game is definitely better for this looting section of the gameplay, and the level design is reasonably good at hiding a bunch of this stuff, particularly the safes and gun cases. They're often in these little hidden nooks, and you do have to use some spatial awareness to find them, so that's a bit of fun. There's also these sheriff stars that are golden that are floating in little hidden places out of sight, and you have to be keen-eyed to find them, and you like everything else in this game, you shoot it, and then you get $3,000. And money, the thing you get from doing all this, wandering around breaking things, is very important for your upgrades, and it's also very important for just purchasing new things such as armor or health, and also your guns. You start with a big iron, let's call it that, and then you can purchase a double barrel shotgun, you can purchase a Tommy gun, and you can purchase a lever action Yellow Boy-esque rifle. And you can upgrade all of these, and the game requires a lot of money for you to upgrade all of this. So there's definitely a point to exploring these hub levels. And as I said, just shooting things is innately enjoyable with the IR camera, so it serves its purpose, but there really is no true navigation in these levels because the layout is simple and the way forward is always marked by a green arrow telling you which exit to take. And it's not a bad thing in this game per se for a more directed experience, but for a game that has hub-like levels, it could do with a little more exploration and how do I put it, more mechanical variety. Aside from shooting things, the only thing you can do is climb things or jump gaps, and that's all done with the A button, and it's all delineated and highlighted so that it's really just, I don't know how to put it, some fanfare. You're not jumping from place to place, you're just hitting A, and the guy's doing it for you. I'll admit that it does more good than harm, these little climbing and jumping sections because it illustrates that your character is very agile, and since mechanically speaking you are agile in the combat, there's no disconnect. It's just a bit of brain dead animation that works, and it gives the levels some scale, and I don't really know what it's something. It gives the levels something, but it's not. There's no game design in it. At the very least, it makes transitioning between areas and floors look nice, I guess. That's what it does. The level design isn't bad. At the very least, they often look nice. I particularly like the last set of levels, Tiger's Nest and Rattlesnake Canyon. If I was to describe it, it's a Western-style Utah canyon, but then it has a Japanese-esque fortress nestled within it. So taken together, it serves as a nice backdrop for the level, and most of the levels succeed in that as well. The nighttime train level, where you're going from roof to roof, is really striking as a backdrop too. There's lots of neon signs giving that level a good mood. So all these levels look good, but they're level design wise, they're only serviceable. And in terms of levels, the mission structure is only serviceable as well, because there's not much to it really. It all amounts to pressing buttons or opening doors and getting into fights in these arenas as you do so, or blowing up 10 trucks, or hitting more buttons to open slowly, opening doors. It's just things like that. Like, it's not incredible by any means. The mission structure is whatever, and the side missions are whatever as well. And they result in a lot of back and forth where you do a mission, then you go back to this bulletin board to pick up another mission, and then you do that one, and maybe you do some side missions while you're going back and forth. Or it's really, as I said, it's a lot of opening doors or doing little Wii motion control mini games, and then finding collectibles, or shooting collectibles rather. That's, if I'm honest, it's usually a matter of shooting things, whether that be posters or guns. So yeah, it's not incredible by any means. It just kind of does its job. Now that I'm on a negative train of thought, in terms of negatives, the motion controls are very good in this game, but they're not always perfect. And I think the developer knows that. The Tiger move, which is a Kusagari move that you can get, I think it's just taught to you by your sensei type character. It's a repost, essentially, kind of like the shield in Skyward Sword, where if you time the shield movement just right, you'll knock them off balance, and that's exactly what the Tiger is. And I think in terms of games like Wii Sports Resort, Sword Fighting, or this game, is the horizontal guard to block vertical attacks is always a little fiddly. Either it's sluggish to go into that stance, or after you get out of the stance, the motion controls, the accelerometer, has a hard time resetting you to your default stance with your sword point up. And so doing vertical slashes after doing that vertical guard, or horizontal guard, pardon me, they don't always register. It's all out of sync is what I'm saying. And so while the horizontal guard does work for those strong attacks when they come, I think they kind of give you an out with the Tiger where you can use that and it will work on any attack, no matter what direction it's coming from. So you're better off just using that all the time. and you never have to do any real directional blocking. So the developer did a good job of accounting for the wheeze limitation, but it's still wobbly, and that's a bit sad, I guess, that you can't manually defend. You kind of just have to cheese this counter, which the counter actually works really well, I should say, in terms of motion controls. You just hold A and then you jab the nunchuck and Wii Remote forward at the same time, and you'll hold out your sword, and the guy will be thrown off balance if he hits it. So, I mean, the motion controls, they are as good as they can get, but they're not perfect still. And as for other complaints while I'm here, I mean, I don't think the story's bad. It's just kind of, I mean, it's kind of hokey and cheesy. I'm sure someone might like it. It's just a story about a magical sword and a evil clan that's trying to get a hold of it. The Katakara, that's their name. It's not a bad name. And you're an exile from the clan that has the sword, and they give it to you perhaps because they foresee their own demise, and when you are dragged kicking and screaming back to your hometown of whatever it's called, they're all dead, and you have to take vengeance with this sword that this Katakara clan is after. The voice acting isn't great, in my opinion. Well, it's not really the voice acting. It's the fact that people are kind of just talking to a silent protagonist. And in my opinion, that always makes a scene flat. I'm not sure it's ever really worked. With text, it's fine, but with voice acting, it's, I don't know. It's not incredible by any means. There's no back and forth or interaction of any kind. And the writing itself isn't incredible by any means. It's intentionally cheesy, but again, that probably fits with the rest of the game and the quality of the story. The story is inoffensive, is what I'm saying, and is neither good nor bad, ultimately. But personally, if I was listening to it and someone walked in, I'd feel a little embarrassed, I guess, because I'm insecure. Yeah, that's all I'll really say about the story. It's fine. The characters range from okay to less okay, I guess. And I almost forgot, but this will bother some people. It doesn't really bother me because I don't care about this all that much, but the doors in this game take a long time to open. They just do. I guess the game is taking a while to load, but you'll open up a door or push on it for a long time, and it's kind of whatever, but I know a lot of people would be annoyed by it. Just those hidden loading screens taking a long time to load. And that happens all throughout the game and never goes away. And so in terms of cons, that's really all I have to say. There's no real glaring issues except for maybe the loading of new areas, I guess, for some people. But mostly everything wrong with the game is just a matter of being incredibly average. But since the gameplay is so enjoyable and cool and unique and one of a kind, it gets away with that average level design and mission structure. For the most part, anyway. I will say that the bosses in this game, while they're a lot of fun, they're not as iconic or interesting as they should be. It's mostly a matter of trading blows with them, and for most of them, it's just using the tiger on them to repel their attacks and then hit them. And they, how do I say it? They just feel like they could have used a little more design. It ultimately comes down to a game of trading damage with them, which isn't bad by any means. It's fine. You can use a number of moves on them that will work without any specific sort of rinse-repeat contrivance like in a Zelda game. But if I was to say what has better sword battles with its bosses, this game or Skyward Sword, I think Skyward Sword would win, ultimately. Skyward Sword's encounters, when they work, are a little more memorable, despite the fact that its combat is more simplistic. And I think that just kind of comes down to more hands-on design with those encounters. And likewise, the main encounters in this game don't feel that designed either. And so when I was going through the challenge mode, it just kind of seemed like, not that they blurred together, but that they just felt like there could have been more done. The developer does add more enemy types and more interesting enemy types and faster enemy types and things like that, but ultimately most encounters boil down to the same thing. You take out the guys with the guns and then you go after the guys with the swords. But as I said, luckily you have so many cool moves to use that it's always fun, even if it's not incredibly unique or any real change of pace. Like, as I said, perhaps my last show, that the game of Resident Evil 4 was really good at changing up encounters through its level design and layout and the different enemies that might come at you. This game, it's just kind of a flat arena, and you usually just go after the enemies according to their proximity or their threat level. Kill the closest guy or kill the baddest guy there first, and then work your way down. And as I said before, and I'm going to be repeating myself, the game's combat is fun enough that it gets away with it. And the game structure does its job at spacing out these combat encounters to the point that they never lose their novelty, I would say. So at the end of the day, the developer did enough work to keep the gameplay loop interesting. And that's all the broad strokes on Red Steel 2 that I have. If you hear beeping, that is a bobcat doing some work. As for any stray thoughts, the fact that you can shoot someone in the knee and that causes them to fall down to their knees, and then you can just execute them like that on the spot with the swing, is really enjoyable and a really nice combination of gun and sword action. I like that one of the sword skills, if you're using it as an execution, the protagonist will throw the sword into the guy as he lies on the ground and then dash over and retrieve it. It's a really slick looking animation. I also really like the execution with the Tommy gun. It's a cool thing. You can hit them in the face with the butt of the machine gun, and then you spin it around and shoot them in the body as they rise up from that strike. Something like that. And here's a little story thing that I think is funny and irrelevant, but at the end of the game, when you've beaten the main villain, you take your special sword and you stab him through with it, and then you break the sword off at the handle. And must not be that good of a sword if you can just snap it off with your own strength real easy. Maybe he just broke the handle and the tang of the blade was perfectly intact, but it didn't seem that way. So the entire MacGuffin of the game is stupid, worthless. It's a cheap blade, but whatever. I mean, again, it's entirely irrelevant, and I don't actually care. It's just kind of funny. I almost forgot to mention this, but if you do play this game, it's definitely worth it to pay the options menu a visit. There are a number of customizable things that you can do that the game allows you to do that you might not think of doing. For one thing, if the only thing, you should switch the swing mode on the remote to relaxed, because that makes pulling off strong attacks much, much easier. And as someone who played the game on normal swing mode, I definitely felt like I was wrenching my elbow sometimes. And for whatever reason, I had a hard time making the left to right swing register as a strong attack, no matter how hard I swinged. Maybe that's just my failure to do a fluid motion, but that problem doesn't really exist in relaxed mode. You can also mess around with the bounding box of your IR control. The default setting I find to be a little finicky because the bounding box is so small that if you make any kind of movement to their head or to their legs, you might make the camera go up or down, which actually feels disorienting, and you'll probably just lose your target. So definitely make your bounding box taller at the very least, and I usually prefer to make it a little wider so that I'm not spinning the camera early. Granted, I then ran into trouble of having a sluggish camera where it turned too slow because I had to move the reticle all the way to the edge before it would do anything. But you can kind of avoid that by just locking onto enemies with the Z trigger. So it's never as big a deal as it is in, say, GoldenEye. But like GoldenEye, you can mess with the bounding box to your liking. And I'd definitely make sure to do that if you did play this game. An important thing to remember, go to the options menu for this game. And with that, I think I'm out of stray thoughts and out of thoughts in general. Not a thought left in my head. So I will move on to a quick summary, and then I'll give this a number score, and then I'll give it a ranking. So to summarize Red Steel 2, just as the very valuable loot in the hub levels is situated in somewhat boring and ho-hum level design, so also this excellent gameplay that is a true gem is situated in a merely above average game. Because the gameplay is so good though, it pulls it off. It also helps that the game looks really good and sounds pretty good too. And the combat upgrades in the game give the hub levels a reason to exist as well. And the hub levels, in turn, give the combat a greater context to operate. So it's not like the developers did nothing at all. It might be that the developers decided that you really couldn't over-design this kind of combat, and it was best left to speak for itself without any overbearing constraints. And that might simply be it. So that's really the game in a nutshell. It has one really excellent thing about it, and then a couple pretty good things, and then the rest of it's kind of above average, but it doesn't matter too much. And with that said, I will now give it a number score. In terms of pros, I mean, the game looks really good, sounds really good, plays excellently. It uses the Wii Motion Plus hardware extremely well. It has a one-of-a-kind fighting system that's never been replicated to this day. The upgrade path is really good for the most part in this game. And the enemy models look really good, and the destructible environments are fun to destroy. In terms of cons, the level design is ho-hum, the mission structure's ho-hum, the side quests are ho-hum, and the combat encounters sometimes feel like they lack a finer touch. So, with all those things in mind, I'm going to give the game an 8 out of 10. It's not a perfectly executed game, and it's certainly uneven overall as a package, but the combat in this game is just excellent. So it gets an 8 out of 10, and I'm even going to give it an award, a special award. And that award is Best Use of the Wii Hardware. So confetti and ribbons and stuff like that. As for how it compares to other games I've reviewed thus far, it's actually fallen somewhat. I was ready to put this game on top, and I don't think I'm going to do that anymore. And that's probably because the challenge mode kind of divorced the gameplay from its greater context to a point. So, I mean, I kind of have to account for that. But nevertheless, I would say this game does not go above Mario Strikers Charged. I just think Mario Strikers Charged is a more mechanically rich game overall, even if it's not as novel. The putting together of team compositions and executing perfect plays, or attempting to execute perfect plays, is greater than that of swinging the sword in Red Steel 2. And I think the weird dystopian world of Mario Strikers Charged is more interesting than this east-west fusion. So, this game goes below Mario Strikers Charged. While Red Steel 2 certainly uses the Wii motion hardware much more effectively than Punch-Out, I think that Punch-Out's combat encounters, its boss fights, are more finely tuned, even if they're not as varied in mechanical considerations and style. And furthermore, Punch-Out isn't weighed down by any sort of ho-hum game design. So Punch-Out, being lean and mean, goes above Red Steel 2. As for Rabbids Go Home, I think Rabbids Go Home tells a much better story than Red Steel 2 in its own interesting way without telling a story. And I think the gameplay of Rabbids Go Home is also really unique, though also sometimes underdeveloped ever so slightly in a manner similar to Red Steel 2. To an extent. Like, they're not that similar. It's a little hard for me because these games are kind of an inverse of one another to an extent. Rabbids Go Home is a game that is greater than the sum of its parts, in my opinion. And Red Steel 2 is a game that's held up by only one true excellent thing. I think I'm going to give it to Rabbids Go Home. Rabbids Go Home goes above Red Steel 2 because I appreciate how things ultimately come together more than minute-to-minute gameplay at the end of the day. Even though Red Steel 2 does a really good job of persuading me to do otherwise. And then you have Sin and Punishment 2 and Red Steel 2, which is better? I'm going to give it to Sin and Punishment 2 as well. I definitely enjoy Red Steel 2 more than Sin and Punishment 2, but the problem is by the end of Red Steel 2, I was kind of happy that it was over. Like, I thought maybe if it had gone on any longer, it would have dragged in some capacity. Whereas Sin and Punishment 2, while I didn't get into this personally, the replay value of Sin and Punishment 2 is definitely there. It feels like you've just begun its true gameplay loop, whereas with Red Steel 2, it feels like the game ended just on the bleeding edge of getting tedious. Never got there, but it feels like it almost did. And that speaks to the overall power to resonate that Sin and Punishment 2 has, that Red Steel 2 doesn't have, even if Red Steel 2 has a great power of novelty. And I've played Red Steel 2 3 times now, so it's not like it loses its novelty. It's certainly fun. It's just, it's not an experience that you can prolong. And that is why Red Steel 2 is going underneath Sin and Punishment 2. As for Red Steel 2 versus No More Heroes, I would say, generally speaking, I probably prefer No More Heroes to Red Steel. But, I mean, Red Steel 2 does a really good job of having a excellent, pronounced gameplay experience where, as I mentioned with No More Heroes, the times when it needed to shine in gameplay, it didn't necessarily. It did with the bosses, but the general fighting sections of the game were just so boring and overbearing. But flaccid combat execution aside, the game of No More Heroes I consider to be more than the sum of its parts in some intangible way, whereas Red Steel 2, at the end of the day, amounts to just the one part, and that is the combat, which I really enjoy. I have a correction to make. I am changing Red Steel 2's score from an 8 to 7.5. And I am putting it beneath No More Heroes. And I will keep it above No More Heroes 2 because the singular manner of excellence that Red Steel 2 is greater than the whole package of No More Heroes 2. I don't know if I explained that beautifully, but that's why it's staying where it is. That was a hard one to rank. I might change my mind next week and put it back above No More Heroes and leave it back at an 8, but I don't know. It's I don't really want to talk about it anymore. So my ranking as it stands currently is Mario Strikers Charged at number 1, Punch-Out at number 2, Rabbids Go Home at number 3, Sin and Punishment 2 at number 4, No More Heroes at number 5, Red Steel 2 at number 6, No More Heroes 2 Desperate Struggle at number 7, Wario Land Shake It at number 8, Metroid Other M at number 9, GoldenEye 007 at number 10, Excite Truck at number 11, and Battalion Wars 2 at number 12. And with that, this show has come to an end. If you have any questions or comments, or have an answer to my Red Steel 2 dilemma, you can send all that over to the email address nalistenerq@gmail.com. That is nalistenerq@gmail.com. But until the next show, have a great day and God bless.